All right, everyone. So while people are coming in, we're gonna go over some announcements real quick. So the A3 midpoint submission was actually due last night. We did decide to change up the policy a little. So if you do want a feedback, then all you have to do is just make an ed discussion post, and we'll respond to you. So for, I guess, future midpoint submissions, so just A4, if you don't need to submit anything on CMS, what we're gonna do is that we're gonna go and check your GitHub history. If you put in some effort, and if you are like really on track, then we'll give you 5 points. But if you try to bullshit it and write like one line of code, or not do anything at all, you're gonna get a 0 for it. So I mean, it's just to help you free 5 points. So yeah, start early. And then A4, we changed the rubric a little, so now it's less punishing. Everything up to the midpoint submission is worth a lot more than after the midpoint. And so in the final submission, if you don't complete all of the tasks or all of the parts, you'll be fine. Yeah, what's up?
Wait, so even if we submitted the midpoint, do we need to like make an edit post?
If you want feedback.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you want us to look at your midpoint submission and see if you're on track or see like if you have any issues, then we'll give you feedback.
And it's just like in the format of like a response to it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, like basically we just download your thing from GitHub, see if there's any errors, and like comment on your code basically.
Okay, cool, thanks.
All right, so just to recap last lecture, we learned about an HTTP request. It's basically a request that is used to communicate between the client and then the server. So on our side, we are the client. We create iOS apps, so we're the client. The server will be some kind of backend server, and we only care about two kind of requests: a GET request as well as a POST request. And so a GET request is a retrieve request, so we get information from a backend, whereas a POST request, you're creating some data or you're updating a data in the backend, so you're posting something to the backend. And then we typically use JSON, which is a language independent notation that we use in order to communicate between our front end with their backend. So the backend code could be written in JavaScript, for example, or in Python, whereas in our code we write it in Swift. But how can we communicate between both of those? We typically use JSON. And then when we make network requests, we typically use callbacks because we don't know how long that request will take. So in other words, we want the callback function to call us back whenever they receive a network request. And then last but not least, our struct needs to conform to this protocol called Codable that allows it to be decoded and encoded from JSON. Are there any questions? All right, sounds good. So in today's lecture, we'll actually take what we've learned in the previous lectures about HTTP requests and actually write some Swift code to, do that. So the first thing I want to talk about is Alamofire. It's pronounced Alamo, not Alamo or any of that. It's pronounced Alamo. So Alamofire is an HTTPS networking library that's written in Swift. And in Swift, there are many ways in which you can implement networking. You can use a built-in Swift thing called a URL session, but that's a little bit complicated to use, especially for an intro-level course. So we decided to use this thing called Alamofire, which basically kind of makes it a lot easier to use. And what does Alamofire do? Well, it allows us to do whatever we want it to do, right? You can create HTTP requests to, fetch some JSON. You can pass in data to a backend. You can also download an image, and then you can also do authentication with it as well. Okay.
Okay, so now that we've mentioned what Alamofire does and how we're going to use it for iOS development, specifically, how do we actually incorporate it into our Swift code? So that's where the Network Manager comes in. So a Network Manager is basically a class that is used to store our backend calls. So you can see here, it's the same as you would define any class. You would define it yourself, but first make sure you import Alamofire. And basically in this one class, we store all of our functions that we want to use to communicate with the backend, whether that being fetch or post or update or delete. In this class, again, we're only focusing on get and post. So this is where those two functions will be defined. So this is where you define them, and this is where you will also be able to call them from. So keep in mind, there's that sort of shared static variable called shared. You don't really need to know exactly why that's there, but know that that's called a singleton sort of instance. Basically, there's only one instance of the class that we want to use, and we refer to that instance anytime we want to call one of the functions there. So inner network manager is sort of where you're going to define as well as call, or you're going to refer to the network manager's shared instance when you want to call any of the functions that you define. So to reiterate, we define all of our networking functions, all of our backend calls are going to be defined in this one network manager, and we're sort of going to refer back to each time we want to make a call, so we don't have to define the function over and over again. So Vin is actually going to demo how to do that with the GET request.
Yeah, so first I'm going to demo how to use the GET request. You can download the demo code from the course website, or not download, but get the GET link for it. It's in the section right here. If you go to GET requests, or right here.
And this might be a good lecture to follow along with, because this is sort of like one of the more important lectures where we're sort of tying together everything we've learned in the past with sort of what we're doing later on, which is with connecting our code with the backend. So this like one lecture sort of teaches you how to connect our front end with all the backend code.
Yeah. So once you clone the repository, you can go ahead and open it up, and this is what it looks like. Okay. So I don't know if I don't have it run yet, but I'm gonna run it right now. So while it's loading, I'll just basically go over what this kind of code or what we wrote before. So we basically have a table view that contains basically a list of members. And in the last lecture, we created we had an HTTP request that returned all of these members. So as you can see, this JSON contains 3 fields: a name, a position, and a subteam, and they're all strings. So what we want to do with that information is we go to our models, and then we create a struct out of that. So I created a struct with the name, subteam, and position. Now, before you actually implement your code with a backend, you always want to test it with dummy data first. So I created dummy data. You can copy this, or you could have just copied that and then put it right here. We just typically like to keep it over here just to make it a lot more neat. But then again, you can always just like copy this code and then put it right here. But it does the same thing. Okay. And then so it's just a basic table view. It's just a basic table view in which these cells contain just one label, and that label just represents that person's name. Name, subteam, as well as her position, all separated by commas. So our goal is to get this kind of request from our backend and then import it into our app right here. Okay. It should be loading any second now. Come on. Okay, my app doesn't want to load. So yeah. Oh, okay, now you want to load. Okay, so basically it's just a table view in which each cell contains a name, the position, or the name, the subteam, and the position. So all of this is hard-coded dummy data. But now I actually want to connect our app to the internet. So first, what I'm going to do is create some kind of function in here that will fetch all these data, all of this data from the backend. So originally first, I'm going to make this thing a list of members, and then I'm going to initialize it to an empty array first. So we don't want to use dummy data. We want to use our backend, or the data from the backend now. Okay. So I want to make this empty at first. That way, whenever I call this, or when I load our app, while that network request is being fetched, it won't have any of your dummy data. It'll just have no data at all. Okay. And then next up, I'm going to create some kind of function to kind of fetch this request. So what I'm going to do is create a function called fetch roster. So I'm going to create, actually I'm going to call it, I'll call it get roster. So I'm going to create a function here, mark as private, call it get roster. Okay. So I guess intuitively, what do you think this function will do? Well, this function is probably going to give us a list of members and then assign it to this members variable. So let's try to do that, right? Let's try to let's try to call some kind of network request and get all the members. So to create that network request, earlier Richie mentioned that we create some kind of class called a network manager where we put all of our backend calls inside of. So what I like to do is create a new group and call it networking. And then inside of that, create a new file, choose a Swift file, call it networkmanager.swift. Okay. And so basically, we use Swift Package Manager now instead of CocoaPods. If you do have CocoaPods, then you should be fine. But the demo code for today uses Swift Package Manager, so you don't have to deal with the pods at all. And Alamofire should already be there. So first, I want to import Alamofire. So import Alamofire. So I create a class called Network Manager. Okay. And then we usually create a shared singleton instance. And we make it a static variable. That way we can access it in different classes. So you say static let shared. And then we're going to create an instance of this network manager class. Now, of course, we don't really need to do this, but the reason why we do this is because we only want one instance of this network manager at a time. We don't want to create, have multiple things trying to call one request at a time. We only want one request, one object calling a request at a time. And then because we do this, we usually want to make our initializer private. That way, other classes can't really call this class. Only this class can do it. So create a private init. Okay. Now we want to create some kind of network request to fetch it. So let me create a function. Now I'm not going to mark it as private because I want other classes to be able to call this function. So I can say func fetch roster. Now, I guess intuitively, what do you think this function is going to do? Well, if it's fetching a roster, let's try to return it a list of members, right? Return it an array of members. That way, we can call this function back in our view controller. So in here, I can do network manager dot shared. You make sure you use shared, and then dot fetch roster. Now that returns a list of members. So now what we want to do is assign that to the variable members. So let's try doing that. Say members is equal to this. Okay. And then if you go back to your network manager, now in here, this is where I actually want to create that network request. So again, we use Alamofire to do that. So you do Alamofire AF dot request, and then you first want to pass in some URL. So what I'm going to do is create a variable here called endpoint, and that's going to be some URL in which we're going to be fetching it from. So I can just copy and paste this right here. If you're following along, I believe the previous lecture might have this link, so you can just copy and paste it, or you can type it all. So you want to pass in that endpoint to this Alamofire request, and so now it needs some kind of method. So who wants to tell me whether or not this is a GET request or a POST request? A GET request, right? Because we're getting information, we're not giving information. So you method, and then you want to use .get for a GET request. Okay, and so now what do we do? Okay, well, this request, remember, it could fail. If it fails, then it gives us an error code that's not between 200 or 299. So it doesn't start with a 2. So we want to kind of like filter all of that. So to do that with Alamofire, you can just simply do .validate. So what this does is that you can see right here, it validates that it's between 200 and 299, which means that our request was good. So we want to validate that. And then what? Now we want to actually decode that data. So when I call this GET request, it actually just gives me this JSON. but now we want to actually decode it into our object. So to do that, you want to use dot response decodable, and then remove all of this right here. Now, the first parameter it takes in is an of, so you want to give it some type that we want to cast it to, or decode it to. So in this case, you can see that there's a square bracket here indicating that it's some kind of list, some kind of array. And so it's going to be an array containing member objects. So I want to decode that into member, and you want the actual type itself. So you do member.self. Okay? And then you want to pass in a decoder to actually decode this JSON. So you do decoder, and you want to pass in a decoder. So what I'm going to do is actually create some kind of JSON decoder. I can say let decoder will be equal to a JSON decoder. And now I'm going to pass in this decoder that we created in here. Okay. And now the last thing it's missing is some kind of completion handler. So I usually do response in. You don't really need to worry about like what this thing really means. All you need to do is just like kind of like use the syntax and try to understand like what like this thing means or like what the decoder is. But this you don't really need to care about. Okay, so what is a response? Well, this response, if you look at this type, it's some data response provided by Alamofire. So we can do response. There's a property in here called results that returns some kind of result. So response.result. Now this is a little bit advanced, but then again, just kind of like know how to use it. So we want to use a switch statement here, right? So we want to switch on the response.result. Now, what kind of result could the response give us? So you want to split up into different cases. So there's a case called .success, in which if it succeeds, it gives us a list, an array of members. So we can say let members in here. For now, I'm going to put like a break statement, but we're going to replace that later. Otherwise, there's going to be some kind of failure. So you do case.failure, and then it gives us an error. Now, what do you want to do with that error? Well, typically, we kind of just want to print it out so that we can see what's wrong with it. So what you want to do is just print error in NetworkManager. It's always a good idea to put where that error is happening. .fetch roster, and then pass in the error. And then we typically use .localized description to make it a lot more clear. Okay, so now that's done, but then again, it's giving me some kind of error. It's saying that this thing expects this object to actually be decodable. So then again, there's a protocol that our struct needs to follow or conform to called codable that allows it to be decoded. Okay, so now that error goes away. Now what we want to do is actually return these members. So this thing returns a member, a list of members. So I can't use return here, right? If I try to return members, I'm still going to get this error saying that, oh, this closure doesn't really return anything. So what I can do is say, okay, let me just do var members here, make it a list of members, make it empty, assign members, or I'll call this like fetch members, and say, okay, fetch members is not equal to members. And then after the request, I can just return the fetch members. Okay, so I think that looks good. So now let's go to the view controller class and actually call this request. I'll go back and let y'all like catch up a little. Yeah, we can do that later, honestly. I think you can do that part. Yeah. So now what I did was I called that function and then I passed it to members here. Now in addition to that, you also want to reload the table view. So you can do table view dot reload data. The reason why you want to do this is because the table view doesn't know when to reload data. So what we're going to do is that we're going to fetch the roster and then reload the table view. Okay. So now let me try to run this and see what happens. So it starts off as empty, and then it stays empty. So it seems like our table view wasn't given the new members that we fetched. All right, so now what's the issue here? So let's try to debug and figure out why we're not fetching any members. So what I'm going to do is put a print statement here. I'll call it like, I'll put members actually. So we expect this to be the new members that we fetched, right? Because we assign it to this members. Okay, that's odd. Why is it an empty array? Didn't we call fetch roster? Like, didn't this assign fetch members, the members? Okay, so that's weird. Let me try something, right? Let me try to print fetch members here. All right, I'm gonna try to print fetch members here, and then comment or remove this line. So hopefully, printing fetch members does give us the members that we want. Okay, let's check. Oh, it does, right? It gives us the members that we want. But for some reason, when it returns this fetch members, it returns an empty array. Okay, so my intuition is that for some reason, this thing is being called after you return. Let me try something, right? Theoretically, this thing should be printed first, and this thing should be printed second, right? Because you fetch it from response, and then you want to return after you fetch it. So this should happen. It should print out first, and then print out second. Okay, but look what happened. It printed out second and then first. So it seems like I'm returning an empty array before I actually fetched that. Does anyone have any idea why it's doing that? Yes.
In the other lecture, you mentioned that certain functions are like completion based, so it's still fetching the data from the back end, but that's why in order.
Exactly, right? We don't know how long the request could take. And so in that case, we want to use a callback instead. So I'm going to introduce a callback. So to introduce that, what we want to do is pass in an argument or create an argument inside of this function. Right? You can call it whatever you want. We usually call it completion. Now, it needs some kind of type, right? Its type will be a function. So remember, the function doesn't return anything. So you give it a return type of void. But then you pass to this callback some kind of type. So we typically pass in what we want to pass in, which is our list of members. So pass in members there. Okay. So now my callback function is almost complete. We just need to remove this because this function doesn't really return anything. Now one thing I need to do is mark it with @escaping. What this means is that it allows this callback function to be alive even after this function is done. So I'm marking with @escaping. Now what I want to do is, instead of returning fetch members, because it doesn't have a return type anymore, what I'm going to do is, in this callback, or I'm going to call this callback once I succeed. So we don't know how long this will take. We just know as soon as you succeed, pass to my callback function the members, right? You're passing it to the completion handler. So I can pass in, I'll pass in members and then remove this because we don't really need this anymore. So we can delete this as well. So again, get some request. If you succeed, tell the callback, hey, I finished fetching. I'll give to you the members. Okay. Well, now what? Well, sometimes if it fails, we want to usually tell our completion handler, so you just returned nothing, or pass it to it, nothing. Now we go back to our view controller, and now we're going to get some kind of error, right? Because this thing no longer returns anything, it just takes in some kind of callback. So because it doesn't return anything anymore, I want to remove members. Now, remember this function takes in some argument. It takes in a callback, which is a function. So what I'm going to do is use this kind of syntax right here. And then what I'm going to do is this closure right here is going to have in, it's going to take in that members that we were trying to fetch. So I'm gonna call it members in. So basically what's happening is that this right here is actually a function. It's a function that I pass into this function the list of members. So right here, this function right here retrieves that list of members right here. So if we look at the type of members, it's actually an array of member objects, or it's an array of members. So now what do I want to do with that? Well, I want to set members to be equal to that. But then I'm going to use self.members because there's two members here is equal to members. Now there's also one thing I want y'all to do. We won't explain it, but just kind of copy it. We'll explain it in a different lecture. But this is something that you should be doing. Okay. Now what's going to happen is that I call get roster. It's going to fetch the roster, and then what it's going to do is that it's going to reload our table view. Now let me try that. Now you can see that it didn't show up right away, but after that request was done, then it showed up. Okay, so now our callback is complete. There's actually one more thing that I want to show y'all that y'all should do. Basically, this table view.reload data, you want to use this kind of wrap it inside of this kind of code. We won't really explain too much about it, but what I'm doing here is that I'm loading the table view on the main thread. Now this gets a little tricky because we're dealing with concurrency and stuff, but whenever you want to create some kind of UI update, you want to do it on the main thread because everything that's on the main queue has the highest priority, and you don't want your app to freeze. So you want to put all of these tasks into the main thread so that it could be dealt with first. So that's just something that I want y'all to follow, but we won't discuss it. Okay. Now with that being said, Richie is now going to demo a post request.
Yep. So if you guys are following along and you guys aren't able to keep up, you can actually check out the second branch or check out the first branch. I believe it's called 1-get. You can check out that branch and it should have this updated code already. But without further ado, let's jump right in. So you see that we have this sort of add button right here. So what we want to do with this, actually, you can see it's sort of attached to this function, this Objective-C function called add new member. So like before with get roster, we actually want to sort of call a network function right here to sort of add a new member to the backend. So in this case, rather than getting, we're actually posting. So we're going into NetworkManager. Yep, so just like before, we're going to define a new function here, and we'll call it add to roster. However, in this case, we actually want a parameter. Since we want to add a member to the roster, we need to give our function a member object. So we want to call the parameter called member, make it of instance member, and like before, we also want a completion handler, so we can perform concurrent. So we can have that callback. And rather than returning a list of members like we see up here, we actually want to give ourselves back one single member since we want to return that member once we sort of post it. So keep in mind, even though we are actually adding to the backend is still going to give us a response of a member, indicating that that member was successfully added. So even though we are posting, we are still getting that response from the backend. That's why we still need to indicate that we want a member here. So like before, we actually want to use the same endpoint in this case, but you see here, we already have that endpoint here, and you really don't want to do too much repetitive code. As like before, we also need a decoder as well. So what we can actually do here is rather than defining it in each function, we can actually move it up here, make them private, and just define it in the class like above. So rather than sort of defining them again, we can just refer to endpoint as the one defined in the class. So like before, we want to use Alamofire, so we use af.request. And the first thing we want to plug in is that same endpoint. So keep in mind the endpoint won't always be the same, but the base URL will be exactly the same. You just have a different sort of slash. So in those cases, you actually want to use string interpolation to add whatever slash you want, but you'll still use the same base endpoint. So you can still sort of factor it out like this with the endpoint on the outside. So rather than using a GET request this time, does anyone know what sort of request we'll be using to add a member? Yep, exactly, a post request. So instead of .get, we'll use the method .post. So unlike before, with a GET request, this is all you really needed. However, this time we're actually passing information into the backend, right? So what we actually need to do is encode our information into a JSON format. And to do that, we want to define our parameters that we want to plug in. And I believe there is a custom class called parameters, which is essentially a string dictionary. So this is sort of our JSON formatted string. So our first parameter from our sort of model here, you can see that we have name, subteam, and position, and they're all strings. So we go back here, since JSON is string keys, we always want to put our key name as a string. And then here we're actually going to plug in, for the member we're going to plug in here and member.name. So this is referring to the member that we are calling. And then we also want to add subteam as the member subteam. And last but not least, we want to add the position as the same thing. So essentially what we're doing in this step is we're converting our struct into and encoding it into JSON format. So that's what we're doing here by defining our parameters. You can see here this is essentially a dictionary of strings where we have a key as a string as well as the value as a string. So this is our formatted JSON string. So actually what we want to do here now is our AF request also has a parameter field. We can directly just plug in our parameters here like so. And yeah, so that should be relatively the same process as before here, except instead of a GET, we're using a POST request, and we actually have this sort of extra field called parameters where we're plugging in our JSON formatted string. So like before, we want to validate in the case that we have errors, we want to print them out, so we need to validate first. And like before, we want to do response decodable. Okay, I don't know why that took so long, but again, this time we want to decode it again into a member. So rather than a list of members like before, we are only adding one member. So what the backend is going to give us back is the same member object that we added before. I know it seems kind of weird that the backend is giving us a response of a member even though we're adding a member, but that's sort of to indicate that this member was successfully added, therefore by giving us back the same member. So what we want to do here is we want to decode it to a member and again use that same decoder. So we can just use decoder. And like before, we also have sort of this completion handle with the response that we're getting. So response in. And again, same situation, since we are getting a response from the backend, it's formatted in the sort of case of a switch statement. Response.result. And there's two cases again. Success, where we want to get one singular member. So let me break in this case first. And then case of failure, where we have an error, and what we want to do there is print out the error. So error in network manager dot add to roster. Add to roster, and then actually plug in our error localized description like so. So in this case as well, we actually want to use our completion handler to sort of give back that member once we add it to the backend. So our success here would actually indicate that we first want to print a success sort of statement, successfully added member.name to roster. So sort of indicate that we've successfully added this member, as well as sort of giving us back the member object, which is going to be here. If you see here, show could help, I think. You can see that. Oh, okay. It doesn't show it directly, but know that that is a member object that we're decoding here. So we want to do completion member. Right. So there we have it. So like before, I guess even in the error case, we could just return nil, but in this case, we don't want to return anything. We just want to print the error. But completion, on the success that we've actually added the member, we want to return that actual member object to indicate that we've successfully added the user. So now what we want to do, if you guys need more time, I'll let you guys take a look at this again. So essentially, the same process goes as before, except we're adding our sort of parameter field, and instead of a GET request, we have a POST request. So
Yeah, also that print statement, that successful print statement, it's actually a preference. Me personally, I don't like doing that because if you have like a bunch of calls, right, you're just gonna get a bunch of success. You only really want an error. You only want a print statement if there is an error. You don't want to like clog it up. But then I guess for this class, there's not really that many requests, so it might be a good idea to do that to show that you're doing the right thing.
Yep, exactly. Question?
Oh, yeah, I-44, I think positions for
Oh, yes, thank
Good
you.
catch.
That is actually very important. Because, if you don't spell things right, more often than not, you'll get like a 404 error or a 500 error, which indicates that you've most likely spelled something wrong. So yeah, that's a good catch there. They need to be word for word exactly what the backend has. So keep that in mind. Okay, so without further ado, let's sort of do that same here. But first, let's define sort of a member that we want to add. Oh. So let's first create a member. We'll do let newbie equal to member. You'll see we have sort of that constructor. So we'll add Caitlin to our roster. She's on the iOS subteam, and position is just member. So keep in mind we're creating an object in here, but oftentimes you can sort of take in this information from a text field, but just for simplicity's sake, we're just going to create it in the function itself. So like before, we want to call our network manager and refer to the shared instance. And in this case, we want to actually add to the roster. You'll see we sort of have this completion here already. So again, we want to add the newbie here that we created. If you click enter here, again, you want to, just for practice, weak self, and then member, and then guard lets health is equal to self else return. So this is, we're going to go into more detail on why we want to do this later, but just remember to always do this when you're using any sort of network manager. So now in this case, since we don't really want to do anything with the result, we're kind of just going to print something just to demonstrate that we've successfully done it. So we can do newbie.position, member. And then member.name was added to the member dot subteam.
What is that?
Oh, whoops. Okay, so if we see here, now this sort of function is connected to our button as you see it here. So we're using an add Objective-C function, and you can see that we've added it here to our button in the navigation title. So let's run this and see what happens. So if we click add here, we should see in the print statement that we have successfully added Caitlin to the roster, and this repeat message was printed out here when we wrote it just now. So we've successfully added it to the backend. However, you actually see here that somehow
Yeah, that's bold.
okay, yeah, don't ignore that. She's not supposed to be there like 6 times, but we haven't actually added it yet. If you count right here, there's only 5. So we've added a 6th one. So if you actually refresh the app and see, there should be 6 now. Yeah, there should be 6 now. So it didn't immediately update, as you can see. Or there's not what's happening, bro.
I think our students are trolling us and sending a Postman request.
Oh,
right now.
wait, you guys are sending requests too, right?
Probably.
How many of you guys like clicked the button to add?
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay, so it seems like, okay. Yeah, so one of those is the ones that we posted. The rest are from you guys, but one of those was there, and we couldn't see it until we refreshed the app. So that's sort of the issue here. We're not actually updating our view directly. we're actually adding it to the backend, and we're not refreshing it. So I guess Vin can sort of go into how we can actually update our view after we've added it to the backend.
Yeah, just one thing to mention. I'm gonna like actually purposely make that typo again.
Oh yeah.
Because that was actually a really good catch. Loki would have been nice if it actually failed.
So let me made that error.
So now if we actually try to add her again, you can see that, we get some kind of error.
Error 400.
Error
So
400.
does anyone remember what a 400 error means? It means
Yes,
it's
it's
our
our
problem. Yes, exactly.
So our problem was that we forgot that. So that was a really, really good catch. But you see how like having proper error handling actually helps you a lot. Okay.
Also, you know who to blame when something goes wrong.
Exactly. Okay. With that being said, though, now I'm just gonna. Oh yeah, I'm also gonna talk about like. So you see here, the back end actually returns, or it gives you just a member object, but then sometimes that's not useful. Like even in this case, we don't even use it. It actually might be useful, I think, in A3, where instead of using a member, you can pass with a callback some kind of boolean, right? So what you can do is like pass in a boolean here. And if it's successful, then you can just pass in true. And then right here, you can just pass in false to the callback. Now, the good thing about that is that inside of this call right here, I can just do like, instead of member in, you can call like success in. So if that's true, then that means the network request was successful. Then you can do whatever you want with it. Otherwise, you can use an else statement. So then again, you can pass whatever you want to this callback, whatever you think is actually like the most useful. What's up?
So in the post request, like in the switch statement, sorry if you just but like,
Yeah.
okay, we don't have like a completion function in the second case, right?
Yeah.
So like on the call stack, like what's happening for this callback? Is
Yeah.
it like, lingering there the whole time?
Exactly. It just stays there because it's not really being called at all. Actually, I don't know if it actually.
It becomes a little more tricky with Swift. It's not like Java
Yeah.
or Python where you can imagine the call frames. I believe Swift sort of has a different garbage collection system, so I'm not exactly sure how that works. But usually in the case of like a post request, your backend members probably won't give you anything, or they'll give you a boolean. That's usually the convention. If they do give you the member, you can just do that. It's fine if you don't have a completion in your failure region, but usually they should give you a boolean if it's a post request.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes they don't even give you anything at all. Yeah. If they don't, then you could just use like a boolean here, right? Then you just want to tell the callback, yo, the network request was successful. Then you want to pass through the callback true in this case because it was successful. And then it will be more useful here if you want to see if it's successful or not. That will come in handy whenever you're like locking a post inside of A3. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now our issue is that the right number of Caitlyn Jins isn't showing up, or it should show up, but usually what we want to do is like be able to scroll to refresh. That's just like the natural thing to do. So it's actually really, really simple to do. All you want to do is create some kind of property here I'm gonna call it like refresh. It's equal to UI refresh control. So I create some kind of refresh control. Now, usually you kind of want to have like a setup function for it. But in this case, the line of code is really, really simple because you just attach it to the table view. So all you have to do is whenever we set up the table view, just add it to it. So you can literally just say, okay, well, refresh control or refresh, you want to add a target to it. And self would be this class. A selector would be some function that you want to call. Right, so I can call that function get roster. So if I refresh, I want to like fetch the roster again. Okay, and then for you can want to use dot value changed. Okay, now it's giving me this error because when you're using hashtag selector, you want to mark it with @Objective-C. There. So now what I'm saying is that whenever this refresh value changes, whenever you refresh, its value is going to change, and then it's going to call a function to scrape the new roster and then update the table view. And now all you have to do is say the table view. You want to add dot refresh control. Set that equal to the refresh control that you just created. Now I'm going to test it again. But this time, instead of adding Caitlyn Jin, I'll add I don't know, Slenderman. I don't know why Slenderman came up in my head, but it just did.
Done Freddy, man.
Yeah. So now if I click on this, by now y'all shouldn't add a Slenderman yet. But now if I scroll and refresh, that is just a little buggy sometimes. Yeah, I don't know why it does that. And then Slenderman, you now have it. I think what you can do is you can stop the refresh by doing self.refresh dot
And refresh.
and refreshing. Yeah, so that's the issue. You just want to end the refreshing. Okay, so I add Slenderman again. So it stops refreshing. There's another Slenderman down here. All right. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the Kahoot?
Wait, can you scroll back down to the refreshing part that you added in view did load or setup table?
Yeah. Right here. Just these 2 lines of code. That's it.
So notice how the table view itself has a refresh control attribute. Normally that's nothing, but when you set it to a refresh control, it utilizes whatever refresher control you're using. And since that refresh control is attached to our function, it'll essentially call that function whenever you perform that scroll up refresh action.
So, but where do we define refresh? Like, because I thought it was within the scope of fetch roster.
Well, the refresh control is actually created here. It's a property inside of this class. And then what I did was, it's still some kind of view, and this table view takes in a refresh control, a UI refresh control with this refresh control property. And then I basically just configured that refresh control right here. Does that make sense? Okay, what's up?
So is this like the standard way to do get and post requests like all the time? Or is there anything?
Oh, that's actually tricky. I guess on AppDev itself, we don't there's like every app has a different convention. It's kind of really cool because you get to see different stuff. I know like this approach, Richie is like the most familiar with it, but on the apps that I work on, we do it completely different. Yeah.
But all in all, the general sort of structure of everything will be sort of the same concept, except you may not be using a callback in the situation. There's other sort of ways you can process it. The overall effect of encoding and decoding should be relatively the same if you're using an HTTP request. There's also like different ways you can request as well, but for the scope of the lecture and just in general, you should probably just be using HTTP requests in this course.
Yeah. Okay. So we're a little bit over time, but I'm just gonna quickly do a Kahoot. The audio doesn't want to work today. Whatever.
Guys, just imagine the music is there.
Oh wait. I guess it doesn't want to work. Dude, your computer is so slow, dude. Why it's not working?
Because Xcode's open, bro.
Okay. We're gonna get started. There's definitely not 38 of y'all in here, so but we're gonna get started. First question: which of the following is not an HTTP request? All right, now imagine the Kahoot sound is playing. It sounds weird without it. All right, good job. Yeah, a create request does not exist. All right.
All right, true or false? We conform our model struct to codable to allow it to be decoded and encoded. Yep, very good. That is true. In order for us to be able to decode and encode from JSON, we need to establish the codable. Sort of, yeah.
Multi-select. Which of the following correctly describes a callback? All right, good job. Yeah, so all of these are true. A callback is a function, allows us to make asynchronous requests, and it's also known as a completion handler, and you mark with at escaping to allow it to outlive its original function. Yeah. It's so sad without the music. It's less
Less exciting.
less exciting. All right, good job, J0447.
I think
Okay.
they've won before.
Yeah. Just some to-dos. A3 final is due a week from now. You should now be able to do all parts. Hack challenge is approaching. We'll provide y'all more details about that later. All right.